Thank you for bearing with us, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Executive Director of the Civitas Institute, and as Stephen said, it's great to be able to co-host this with the LBJ School and see such a great crowd here. And I'm really pleased to be joined by two fantastic mayors, Mayor Mattie Parker of Fort Worth and Mayor Kirk Watson of our home city here in Austin, Texas, and I'm looking forward to our discussion together. We'll try to keep this on time and also try to accommodate some of your questions, so we'll kind of move through this quickly. I won't belabor the introductions for sake of time, but I want to, you probably know something about both of these mayors, but by way of introduction, Mayor Mattie Parker is currently in her third term and was first elected to lead the nation's now 11th largest city in 2021. Mayor Parker's priorities have been bolstering the city's economic development, expanding education opportunity, improving public safety, and preserving the city's rich heritage. When she was first elected, she was the youngest mayor and the first millennial to lead a major American city. So on behalf of all Gen Xers, I apologize for everything that we said about the millennials' entitlement and all that. Mayor Parker is a licensed attorney with more than 18 years of experience in national, state, and local public affairs and has a BA from the University of Texas at Austin and a law degree from a school in College Station. Mayor Watson won his first term as Austin mayor in 1997 and was reelected with 84% of the vote for his reelection, which is, I think, a higher approval rating than most of us have with our families, so it's impressive. He's widely recognized for bringing together a variety of factions to produce the kind of transformative growth that Austin's known for. And he then spent 13 years in the Texas Senate, where he served on multiple committees and led on education and healthcare and government transparency. But then in 2023, the people of Austin called him back into service by electing him mayor once again. I was here 1 month before your election and 2 months after, before I moved back to Austin, and the visible change was incredible, and that helped make the decision for my wife and I easy to move back here 2 years ago. So thank you for that. Mayor Watson grew up in North Texas, graduated from Baylor and Baylor Law School, where he graduated first in his class. Okay, welcome to both of you. I've got questions for the two of you that you can take turns answering, and then we'll also give our audience a chance to ask some questions. And I apologize in advance if we can't get through everyone's questions, because we do have limited time in this lightning round, as Stephen said, that we structured today to be. Before we talk about housing policy in particular, I just want to talk about growth at the city level, because we are blessed to have two mayors with us who preside over two of the fastest growing cities in the country. I mean, when you look at the top 10 fastest growing metro areas, two of them are represented right here. I've moved around a lot. My family and I have moved around a lot. We've always seemed to move to places where there's lots of construction cranes. Construction cranes have become my indicator of vitality. And I think I just like places that are building. And Austin is one of those places, and Fort Worth is one of those. And so what I wanted to hear you both talk about at the outset is when you think about the economic growth of the cities that you preside over, what do you think about the most, positive or negative? Because I know there are both. And I'd just be curious to know, when people are talking to you a lot about the growth of the city, you've got your own priorities. What's the top of mind for a mayor who's presiding over a city that's known for its growth?
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you all very much for the invitation to be here. I think the question, importantly for me, and we get this a lot, as you can imagine, as a mayor that's now the 10th largest city. We just passed the city of Jacksonville. And for our Austinites in the audience, we're now bigger than the city of Austin as the fourth largest city in Texas. But you can imagine, for those folks that live in Fort Worth, in our city, there's always a level of concern that permeates the question, what are you doing about growth? Because it impacts every single aspect of a city that's run well. And I do think we're a city that is run incredibly well and focused on the basics of city government. But as a comparison, and I know Mayor Watson has been there as well to see it, I went last summer to Detroit, Michigan for a Mayor's Institute. And Mayor Dugan was an excellent host and toured a city and showed us downtown. And by the way, if you haven't been to Detroit lately, I highly recommend you go visit. It's a beautiful city that it's on its comeback, and there's so many exciting things happening. But Mayor Dugan did an excellent job giving us the history of his city that was built for 1.6 million people, that now hovers well south of 1 million, more like 650 to 700,000 people. If you're a city in America that it's not growing, you are dying. And so in Fort Worth, we try to keep that in perspective and focus on policies that are smart today and into the future. And as Mayor Watson can tell you better than most, because he's been mayor and then left office and come back, you oftentimes are instituting policies at a foundational level that you may not necessarily benefit from, but you absolutely know how important they'll be 10 to 20 years from now. And it's probably a big reason why Kirk came back to office, right? He knows how important policymaking is. And last thing I'll say is this, and turn it over to Kirk, is I say this a lot in Fort Worth, and I mean it. The things that matter in city government are not sexy, right? They are streetlights and potholes and making sure you have construction cones and police officers and firefighters and building a city that people want to live in. And as a result, in Fort Worth, people have voted with their feet to live in our amazing city. And so as all of the concern around growth, and Texas should be concerned about that, right? This is why we're here around affordable housing and preparing for the future. But you also have to really institute those policies that really enable affordable housing to even be part of the conversation because you're a city that's growing and thriving.
Well, I'll just piggyback on that because I agree with all of that. And what I'll say is that I say it frequently, that in Austin, Texas, our biggest challenges are a result of success. And that is we are growing. And I agree that if you're not growing, you need to be worried about it. And so it's a question of managing growth, managing the success in order to be able to continue to do that. I was, as has been pointed out, I was mayor 25 years ago when Austin was becoming a big international city. Today, like it or not, Austin is a big international city. And we all have our nostalgia, we all have the kind of things that we want to remember, but if we want to continue to be a successful city, we're not managing decay. So what we need to be doing is we need to be doing the basics. Now, I also think about at least two other things when I think about managing success. One is, how do you manage success in a way that you stay a complete city, that everybody can afford to be a part of this city? And we're going to talk about affordability, but that is something that keeps me awake at night, because with the great success, it changes the market. It changes the market. The other is, how do you have the number of people you need to take care of the basics? So, for example, with infrastructure, we've got about $25 billion worth of infrastructure projects going on right now, and we have to have the people to build those. So what we're attempting to do is make sure we're training enough people to do that, and that adds people that can then afford to live in the city, that don't have to move out of the city. So we try to kill two birds with one stone, if you will, in that regard. But one is, how do you manage the affordability? The other is, how do you make sure you have the population necessary to take care of the basics? Because if you're just a city of only the very rich that moved here from other places, then you're going to be in trouble.
Very good. And you can hang on to that. I'll go back and forth here. Before getting into kind of more details of specific kind of housing policy and the things that you've pursued, I want to talk just more about just kind of the kind of housing supply that you think we need more of, or that you've seen in your particular cities. I'm thinking of that really important demographic, at least I think it's a really important demographic, of like 25 to 35-year-olds. I mean, there's a big difference between the time you're 25 and you're 35. During that time, if you've made a move during that time, especially as you're getting closer to the 30, 35 range, you're probably going to be putting down some roots, right? And that's a big choice. And both of you have attracted that demographic hugely. And it's probably 9 years ago now, we did a study on Texas urbanism. I just realized Cullum Clark did the Dallas chapter, Joel Cuckin did Houston, I did Austin, and Wendell did the numbers for all of us to keep us out of trouble. It's like getting the band back together. And discovered even then that Austin had more 25 to 35-year-olds in the MSA here than the San Jose MSA at the time even. So that's even increased, and you think that's a large swath of Silicon Valley. So those people come and they stay, but to your point, with the challenges that growth brings, and particularly when it comes to the kinds of incomes you're attracting, you need to have housing for these people that actually want to have. It's a first-time home buyer, and right. the young workers that want to live, experience the American dream. That seems like where we're having a real problem right now across the country, not just in our city. So when you think of the type of housing, we can talk more in a minute about specific policies themselves, but like the kind of housing that you think we need more of, and then how we produce it. That'd be great to hear.
Well, I'll start with the why of that. And I was saying we're sometimes very nostalgic in Austin, but one of the things that people ask me all the time is, how do you keep Austin Austin? And what I tell them is we have to keep Austin a city that you can keep the young people wanting to stay here and being able to stay here. We're sitting in what I consider to be a fountain of youth. Every year in Austin, Texas, we have a whole lot of new young people show up. They bring their new music, their new thinking, their new ideas, greater diversity, different culture, and then they say, like they've done for decades, I never want to leave. Well, the question is, how do we make Austin affordable enough and have the living opportunities so that they can? And then when they marry, they start having children. And so we need to have more ability to have starter homes. One of the things, and we can talk about the whys, what's in a minute, but one of the big things that I think we've done well in the last 2 years is changing lot size minimums so that you don't have to have McMansions. You don't have to have a 5,750 square foot lot to build a single family dwelling on. You can now have an 1,800 square foot lot. Well, that means 35-year-olds have greater opportunity to buy their first homes, like, frankly, Liz and I did when we first got here all those years ago. So I think the focus has to be on, and of course you're going to build multifamily and those kinds of things, but you also have to be focused on things like single family, but you got to make it where people will be able to afford it and be able to start and not need a McMansion.
I think to Kirk's point, you have to say yes to everything. And in Fort Worth, we're a city that's 350 square miles, so we're very sprawled, and we're only half developed. So with that, you can see where Fort Worth's headed, and we're in the middle of a comprehensive planning process to really rethink, to your point, what type of housing do we need to be incentiving and really working alongside private developers, nonprofit developers to be in their city. I know we're going to talk about the regulatory environment, but that is incredibly important. In Fort Worth, we have strived to be a get-to-yes city. From that starts with development services, your water department, all of these departments that can really stymie opportunity for all types of housing growth. NIMBYism is real, and I know that that's something that every city really experiences. The Texas legislature this last session passed several pieces of legislation. We could debate whether all of them will get the intended consequences, but some of them are around by right, zoning by right, especially around multifamily. The one nuance I think is important for us to remember, though, and because you mentioned that 25 to 35, Ryan, a 25-year-old starter home, they're not thinking about schools. They better believe they will be at 35 when their kids start school. And so, in my opinion, the city has a great program around neighborhood improvement zones that have the right incentive levels in place to have you build an infill, foreclosed lot, build a new home in a neighborhood that's up and coming or redeveloping, which is wonderful. But if you don't have schools and education opportunities for those students in those zip codes, those families will move out at age 35, 36, 37, and go to the outskirts of your city where school districts are higher performing. And so that's something that every single urban area in America is really grappling with. It's certainly something in Fort Worth. I know Austin also has pockets of concern. And so I think it needs to be an underpinning of a conversation around affordable housing, because you can build all you want to in some of these neighborhoods. But in many ways, I think it's a policy malpractice for also to be thinking about what this opportunity for education and students that are going to be living in those homes at one point, and families that will move out of them long term, and you're back in that same cycle that you kind of created in trying to redevelop neighborhoods as well.
Thank you. And so when you think more specifically about policies themselves, then, along those lines, getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of policy details, like rule changes or certain specific policies that you think, if you could do them en masse, that would make a huge difference in your own city or in other cities across the country. What's your kind of top three, top list now?
Well, it's a menu of options. I think one thing the city of Fort Worth has just embarked upon in the last 2 years was a partnership with philanthropy to, a real community land trust in the city of Fort Worth. Our first project is Old Seminary housing. It's 200 houses, some redevelopment, some new build, 80% to 120% AMI for home ownership. And of course, those homes will allow a family to build home equity as a starter home. But when those homes sell, they stay in the land trust in perpetuity, which allows you to really experiment with the opportunity in an urban core. We also selected neighborhoods where the schools were higher performing, giving parents a menu of options and choices there. So that would be probably number one. I mentioned your neighborhood improvement zones, which are really innovative ways across our city, a cross-section of opportunity for developers and individual homeowners. We also have our Housing Finance Corporation that has purchased lots and holding them and working with nonprofits, churches, individual landholders to redevelop in the urban core. I won't talk about multifamily because that's kind of happening naturally, but we have some really innovative projects, everything from permanent supportive housing to workforce housing that is of note in the city of Fort Worth. And then lastly is what we've done in Stop 6, Texas. Stop 6 Fort Worth was our HUD Housing Choice Grant that we applied for in 2020, 2021. We received the $35 million, and all in, you're going to see over $400 million of private development happen in historic Stop 6. Cavill Place was one of two traditional public housing developments in our city that we went through a rental assistance demonstration project. And I don't have time to describe how complicated this was, but it would not have happened without a private developer at the table, and of course Fourth Housing Solutions has been that possible. And what's really great, you've now seen families, most recently seniors that were probably multi-generational living in Stop 6, being able to return home to live in senior housing and Cavill Place in their community because of that partnership. And so I think those priorities have really now have bared fruit, and it's up to us to kind of continue that work in other parts of the city.
Thanks. Mayor Watson.
Sure. First of all, there's some in the room that get it because they've lived through Austin the way Austin's done it. But I would say that we had a de facto two-party system when it came to housing in Austin, Texas, until about 2.5 years ago. And the de facto two-party system was, I don't want to put the labels on it because I always worry about what that does. But it was a de facto two-party system that was in many ways stopping us being able to put into effect policy. So I think it's not a policy thing, but I think the politics of the situation was that we had to figure out how we were going to get any of it done, or we were not going to get anything done. And I think we've broken through that logjam. So the three policies, I would start with the regulatory aspect of it. When I came into office 2.5 years ago, 2 3/4 years now, but who's counting? When I came in, one of the big things I wanted to do was revamp our regulatory scheme. It was broken. It's still not where I want it. We're still making improvements on it. But it was badly screwed up. And so what we did is we basically did a peer review, if you will, not a peer review, but a performance review from top to bottom of the site planning process, which was what we were told was our worst offender. And we said, you got 9 months to help us figure it out. It was McKinsey. We brought in McKinsey. They came to me early, right after I was elected, and they said, we want to get known better in the community. How do we do that? And I said, well, what I would do if I were you is I'd say, Mayor, we've heard you talk about the screwed up site plan process and the fact that you want to do a sunset review of it. We want to do that for you. And they said, oh, okay. And I said, and then I would say, Mayor, we want to do it for free. We ran into a little bit of difficulty on that part. But the point is, we've made huge change. The city of Austin was adding so much cost to what housing cost in this community in the name of a lot of what you were talking about, that we had to make that change. The second thing is, I mentioned it a minute ago, I actually believe that what will be one of the biggest differences will be what we've done with regard to minimum lot size. I think that will make a huge difference. And then the third that I would say, it would be 3 by right, and being able to come in and put that much development in single family zoned areas. Now, I agree with Mayor Parker that some of the things that we saw in the last session of the legislature theoretically we would agree with. But the consequences of what some of that is going to do is going to cause real problems. And I think that the next step in the policy approaches will be making sure they're working the way we intended. If what we do is we feel like we're on the train and we're getting all this done and we need to do, people all the time ask me, what's next? What's next? Because we've done so much good. What I say what's next is, let's make sure this is working. Because if we're not making sure it works, then we're going to create that de facto, we're going to prove right some of those that were saying you're going to screw this up. And so we need to take a deep breath, stabilize what we're doing, and get it done, even as some who are applauding what we've done want to see even more.
That's really great. I'd like to just talking about the governing through these sorts of changes, and you mentioned the forces of NIMBYism. I'm thinking of Jennifer's opening comments about this kind of what's really become kind of an astonishing bipartisan agreement, or cross-ideological agreement about what we need to do, because that's relatively recent, and it took about 20 years of all kinds of research and coalition building to kind of get there. And so it's great that we have people gathering at a national abundance conference agreeing about this. What I'm wondering about is at the local level. My first policy job was with Mayor Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis, and I worked at the state and federal level above that, and concluded that it's still the toughest job what you do, because your constituents can be there protesting in your face that afternoon after you make a proclamation or a decision. Are you seeing in your cities this kind of agreement? I mean, is the NIMBY, what we call the NIMBY issue, are there examples of the way that people who have been opposed to certain types of development have gotten on board with it, that we can find some encouragement in, or are the forces still just kind of like they've always been?
Well, maybe it's just too soon, but my response to that is I've not seen a major coming together. In fact, I've been disappointed in that. I came up, again, having done this as long as I've done it, I had a lot of friends that are no longer friends over things that we've passed with regard to housing, that will not speak to me when we're in a room together, because they saw what they consider to be the sanctity of the neighborhood. And I've been very careful. I mean, it's always going to get said, and I'm not going to convince anybody not to. But I tell people, you can't use the word NIMBY around me. Now, you can, but you're moderating a panel, so go ahead. But because I worry that the label itself robs us of empathy and puts us in a situation where we're not willing to listen to why somebody might really be concerned. And many times they might be concerned in a way that, well, I'm just not going to be able to, I just don't agree with you. But if we just put the label on and say, well, they're NIMBY and they're always going to be against it, we may miss out good ideas, and we may miss things that we could do so that they would come together. Affordability is a rallying cry. Affordability is a good rallying cry and something that we can build around. But I will say that maybe it's just, like I say, too soon and too new. And then we've had, in my mind, a couple of missteps. And I mean, some of my friends out in the audience know how I feel about DB 90, and it has created more problems than I think it has fixed, and we need to fix it faster than we're fixing it. But again, there's now that you got it, I ain't giving it up kind of stuff. And I think that what happened in the legislature, when people start pushing back on some of those things, we're going to continue to see those divisions. That's part of the reason I said what I said in response to the last question. We're going to have to now be very smart about how we institute these things, or we're just going to keep the division, maybe even grow it in some instances.
Well, so every November there's columns in the New York Times about how to talk about national politics with family members. It sounds like we need like columns about in our local papers about how to talk about housing policy around that Thanksgiving.
Yeah. I think for my experience, I'm kind of curious what y'all have seen in Austin as well, that, to use the term again that Kirk doesn't like, NIMBYism, here's what I've seen lately, is that usually your demographic is your older, more established families that have been a part of neighborhoods and homeowners associations are the loudest voices and very organized, that come to City Hall out of concern for their neighborhoods. And then the other faction you hear from, I loved what Jennifer said about the dogma and this ideology. They're very organized politically, and they've just chosen this issue as their issue du jour of the day. and they're literally stealing headlines out of California to come down to City Hall and scream and yell about. So how far apart do you think those two audiences are, right? And so as a result of that, the toxicity is so high, no one's listening to anybody. I would encourage, and maybe this is a kind of a project for Civitas and those of you in the room that really care about this, oftentimes the very best ideas around, let's take housing policies since we're discussing, is occurring at a national and state level. And it never, ever trickles down to a city where your practitioners and people like myself and the folks in my housing department and your water department and your development services department are actually the ones trying to build housing. They're usually not bureaucrats. They're usually really ready for a great idea. They just don't know any of this exists. And so in order to answer your question, Ryan, to kind of break through what we're seeing, you see it all the time on any various issue, on any zoning case, I do think there's additional help from policymakers and think tanks like this one to help you create more consistent policy. Because let's be honest, if Texas is going to continue this route towards best for all and statewide legislation that's regulatory, that is impacting cities, then you need to make sure that your cities actually know how to implement said policies and work alongside your state legislators, because right now they're not talking. And the most recent example around multifamily, which we're getting all kind of NIMBYism, and we're like, hey, you got to talk to your legislator because now we can't actually stop that case. It's going to happen. Is we have no ability to really regulate from an infrastructure standpoint, right? So now we can't actually sit down with the developer and say, hey, this road needs to be 4 lanes, not 2 lanes. You need a stoplight and a turn lane, because they don't have to go through the zoning process. Yeah, you can hold them up in the site process. That's a whole nother issue that now we have a stop clock on the legislature. So I could go on a tangent, as you can tell. And so cities like Fort Worth, and I know like Austin, are so hungry to be at the table and learn from policymakers that are in this room and others, and make sure we're making the right decisions. Because the reality is, for Texas to avoid what California did, that's the type of thing you need. That consistent regulatory framework is really needed.
That's great. I was actually going to bring this up as the next question, and I'll just do this quickly, and then this will be my last question before I turn it over to you. So we leave a few minutes for audience questions. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask the mayors. But it's this question of what, if anything, state policymakers can and should do, and even federal, which is farther removed. There are some proposals out there, and I won't go through them now, about what the federal government might be able to do to encourage the right kinds of policies at the local level, which we can all be maybe wary of, but also what states should do. I'm just curious if you have additional thoughts, Mayor, just on what you think they should do or stay out of.
Sure. Well, I'm not Pollyanna because I've been in politics now for over 20 years, so I realize, and now is like the heightened period of time we're in, and nothing is bipartisan anymore. But if I could, I would encourage the legislature, especially in that interim charge planning process that both the Senate and the House go through, is rather than just appointing committee members from the Senate and the House, and no offense, most of them are not like Kirk Watson, who served as a senator for 13 years but had experience in local government. You would create a slate of people at the table that are Democrats and Republican mayors from across the state and state legislators that really understand and care about housing policy, and put people like Jennifer at the table to say, what could Texas build if we were all on the same page? Because wouldn't it be beautiful if you start a legislative session with like 10 policies that every major city in Texas was for rather than against, and you had Democrats and Republicans at the table saying, hey, we're going to pass this bill in the first few weeks of session and start implementation immediately rather than fighting through committee hearings. And I do think you could do that if you could convince the right people at the table, and again, having a system like Civitas and UT Austin to say, encouraging, hell, throw in TPPF too. Like, we can all be at the same table. If we really want this to be effective and Texas to look different, I do think you're going to have to try something different around these issues.
She's exactly right. And I'll add a couple of things that may be, maybe I shouldn't. One is the legislature is going to have to quit acting like cities are all stupid and evil. It's just not the case. That's where the people live, and they're choosing to live there, and they're choosing to live in different cities for different reasons. And it's okay for the cities to be different. But right now, you're not going to be able to achieve what I think is a very good suggestion and good results if there is a bias against the cities. The second is, you got to include those cities. I'll underscore it. I'll put it to you this way. Just because I was in the Senate, I didn't feel any smarter than when I was in the mayor's office, right? In fact, you don't know, you're not practicing it, so you're not getting to know exactly how it might have unintended consequences. And let me just say, what you don't want is a bill to be passed and then everybody saying, let me tell you how this is not going to work, and then you have to write letters and say, well, here's what I really intended. That's not the best way to make public policy. So that is the sort of suggestion we need to have. I worry that the lack of bipartisanship is influencing what happens between the legislature and cities. Back to your point, there is some coalition around housing and affordability that's both Democrat and Republican. Maybe they're coming at it for different reasons, but I don't care as long as they're coming together. But as long as the legislature is anti-city because of partisan politics, we're going to have some difficulty with that.
Got it. Very good. Okay. Just a couple minutes for maybe a couple of questions, and again, apologies in advance for not being able to get around to everyone who might have something to say. Right here. And wait for the mic to come to you. This is being recorded, so you have to be okay with that if you're asking a question. It also means wait for the mic.
I have a question for my friend Mayor Watson. I really like the minimum lot size. You brought it up a couple of times. We have had historically in Austin a fairly small supply of lots smaller than 5750 for obvious reasons, because nobody could do anything with those. What can we do to create a larger supply of smaller lots? Because currently the process for subdividing lots is still, shall we say, somewhat cumbersome.
Well, I think you answered your own question. And I think the first thing we are, as many people will tell you, and you probably already know, and I said it a minute ago, part of what we are attempting to do is totally revamp the regulatory process. We started with site planning. We're not as far as I would like to see us on some other things. And in fact, Alexis Garcia, who's on my staff, is in the back of the room and is my land use person, my lead land use person. She's been on the phone today fixing some things that need to be fixed. But I think what we need to do is we need to make it easier. I think a big part of the problem, the best way to start is to get out of the way. And a big part of the problem is that we're in our own way when it comes to that. And I think that's the answer to the question.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Mayor, Mrs. Mayor. You've spoken quite a bit about regulatory aspects. Is anyone doing work in tax policy vis-a-vis property taxation and how that can affect growth? I'm a native Pennsylvanian, and we have cities like Harrisburg and places like that who have split rate taxation for the property taxes where the land value is at a higher rate than the improvements to the land. And they seem to have weathered the big, housing crisis in the late 2000s better than a lot of places. So are people looking at things like that where we can amend and modernize property tax structure and other taxation in order to be, let's say, pro-smart growth?
Well, the Texas legislature loves to work on property tax policy in the state of Texas. But as I try to remind people in our city, in Texas, we're a two-legged stool, of course. We do not have a state income tax. And your city government does not receive money from the state of Texas to fund city government. It is sales tax and special revenues and mostly property taxes. So actually, before I came up here, I checked this. For a house in Fort Worth that costs $237,000, their property tax bill is just south of $1,600 a year for the city of Fort Worth, so $1,587. 1/3 of their entire property tax bill goes to their city. That's for your police officers, your firefighters, your street lights, your streets, your libraries, your parks. I could go on. The rest of it goes to other funds, including school districts, right? That is such an important thing to get across because you cannot properly fund city government without some kind of sustainable fund, and there's nowhere else to come from right now. I do think one thing that we're not looking at closely enough in Texas right now is homeowners insurance, because you've seen huge rises recently that absolutely are impacting homeowners and renters. And I know they dabbled in it a bit this last session, but they have not fixed it. And it's actually impacting rural Texas more so than urban Texas right now. And so to tag on your question, that's an open-ended problem we have in the state that's impacting the ability to afford a home. And then lastly, more so than tax policy, quite frankly, is labor and materials. And because of the issues around immigration right now, we're all experiencing a shortage on the labor front, and something the state of Texas is really going to have to grapple with.
That's a really good answer, and all I would add to it is that tax policy as it applies to cities, that really the only thing that the legislature has spent a lot of time talking about is how to keep us from getting taxes. And in fact, through this whole year, what we have discussed at the legislature is how to reduce the amount of revenue you can get from property taxes before you have to go to the voters. And in Austin, 100%, all of it, toto, of our property taxes goes to public safety. 70% of our sales tax revenue goes to public safety, which means everything else is what we have to take care of everything else out of the rest of that. We're in negotiations with our firefighters right now, and they're demanding a wage increase that is around, the minimum is about 5% per year, and we're capped at 3.5% in what we can do without going to the voters. Well, that's difficult. And when you have a school district that is sending so much of its money to the state, the local taxpayer, the tax burden becomes a real burden, but it's not so much the city that's doing it, but yet the city is the one that people are demanding the services from. We need to be looking at unique things. So I remember the first time I was mayor, I had this great idea about people, let's say you had a 2-1, and you said, Mayor, we really liked our 2-1, but when we bought the 2-1, we were newly married, we didn't have children, and now we've got a couple of kids, and but we can't afford to move up. We can't find a house to move. And my thought was, what if we could let you add on to that house? You could afford the loan to build a third bedroom and a second bath. What if we let you do that, and we would incentivize you doing that by not increasing your property taxes based upon the increased square footage of that house? And I'll never forget saying that to the city attorney and him looking at me and saying, Mayor, that's really smart. And I thought, yeah. And he said, it's illegal. Okay. Those are the kinds of things we ought to be thinking about. We ought to be thinking about how we would go about doing those things. One of the issues that we're facing, and we're going to be talking about very soon, to Mayor Parker's point, is you want to put an ADU, you want to do that? Well, we'll add to the cost of that by requiring a separate meter for those kinds of things. I mean, we've got to look at all those costs, but when it comes to property taxes, we're pretty much helpless. The legislature needs to do that, and they're not thinking about housing policy.
One thing I should add is we do have CCPD in the city of Fort Worth, so we use our sales tax pennies. Half goes to transit, and the other half penny goes to Crime Control Prevention District that's been in place since the 90s, and we just went back to voters for 10-year extension, so it really does help alleviate some of that burden on public safety for police specifically over to your sales tax, which of course does help mitigate a bit.
Thank you so much, both of you, for spending time with us here. Really do appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Very good. Thanks very much. You both have very hard jobs, and we appreciate the job you're doing. Just give us a couple minutes while we get the next group up here and stay with us.